Welcome everybody again to our community webinar. We've been putting on this community webinar series for quite a while now, at least over a year or so. We've been coming up with a variety of different topics and items that we thought would be of interest to the community, get the community together, whether it's leaders from companies that are growing or hiring on the recruiting front or on the hiring front, or Bincers from all levels of our organization, from recruiters to recruiting leaders to folks on the people ops side, really for the benefit of getting together, sharing on items of interest, learning, and having an open discussion about topics that are relevant and of interest to our space. Right now, given all that's going on in the world with COVID-19, everyone's dealing with some slightly different version of life or professional experience than they might be dealing with otherwise. So we're kind of speeding up the timeline from inception of idea to the presentation of content. So this webinar was turned around in 1 week of prep, and really for the main benefit of addressing the content and topics that are most on each of our respective minds. For this specific topic, we thought that it'd be neat to talk about both how to get hired and getting hired remotely. Moving to a remote world is something that our entire kind of marketing community and really country has been moving to. And so rather than focus on just one aspect of it, how to get hired or how to hire, we thought we'd talk about both, bring both parties together, create a little bit of empathy, perspective, and insight that both sides can benefit from. That way, if you're trying to get hired remotely, you could both learn those tips and techniques as well as gain some insight on how those that are hiring are best setting themselves up for success, and vice versa. So that's the purpose of this webinar. We're very excited for Liz and Leah, both recruiting managers at Binc, to be sharing with us, who bring a wealth of experience both on the side of working with companies that aggressively and actively hire, both in a remote and when it was reasonable to hire in person capacity, and in the representation of candidates in helping them navigate through these respective processes. We're very excited for Liz and Leah to be with us and share. And then Tani will be joining us as well to help moderate the Q&A session. So what you can expect for this webinar is about 30 minutes worth of content from Liz and Leah. And then as you hear the content, it's meant to engage discussion, engage question, prompt question. So definitely be generous in the sharing of questions that you have, either in the chat or in the Q&A box. And then Tani will use that to moderate the following the last 30 minutes of this session for open Q&A. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Liz to take us from here.
Great. Thanks, Boris. So before we get into the content, we thought it would be nice to sort of set a little bit of intention behind why we're here and why we're talking about this. So Boris sort of mentioned this as well. We're in a fairly chaotic, ever-changing time, which is affecting everyone in sort of a different way. And so we're asking, we're being asked to adapt pretty quickly. And so remote hiring and interviewing remotely is something that may be new to a lot of people. And so the thread that we want to sort of weave through here is fostering empathy between companies who are interviewing and hiring remotely, and job seekers who are making a really big decision on a job change, potentially for the first time in a fully remote process. So keep that in mind as we sort of move through this content, is that, if you take anything away, the goal is to really have you walk away with some empathy for everyone else who's experiencing this, as well as hopefully some tactical pieces that will help make this experience smoother as we sort of navigate this together. So I'll kick it over to Leah to talk about sort of what the agenda will look like.
Thanks, Liz. So we're going to cover kind of 4 areas. We will briefly cover some of the common challenges of a remote hiring process, and then what the advantages are of a remote process. And then we will look at remote hiring through the lens of a company. And then we will inversely look at interviewing remotely as a job seeker or a candidate. So we are going to kick things off with a poll question. And that question is, which positions do you currently identify with? Are you hiring remotely, looking remotely, or just a casual observer? So I'll give you a few seconds to answer that. All right, so it looks like a lot of you are here because you are hiring remotely, which is really good to see. And then we also have some job seekers as well. And we also have some casual observers. Hi there, you guys. So let's jump into really quickly some of the common pitfalls of a remote process. A remote process really runs the risk of sometimes feeling a little bit impersonal because you don't have that aspect of going into an office or meeting with colleagues face to face. And so, you know, it may feel a little bit transactional and could be difficult for candidates to connect in the same way as if they were interviewing in person. So that's one common pitfall. Another common complaint is that remote processes feel really unorganized. Companies maybe don't communicate with candidates, so candidates have no idea what the next steps are in the interview process. They don't have a good idea of the decision-making timeline. And this often will lead candidates to just take another offer of a company that has a more built-out remote process. And both of these things, the impersonality and the disorganization, can lead to uncertainty on both sides. So as a candidate, you don't really know if you want to work for this company. You get to the interview process, end of the interview process, and you're kind of like, oh, I don't know. And then from the company lens, you may not be sure if you actually want to give that candidate an offer. So hopefully we're going to provide some tips in this webinar to help you avoid those three things. And then some of the advantages of having a remote interview process. So we are in a new market. We're in a new space right now. And in this new market, there is a ton of incredible talent up for grabs. And companies who are hiring right now, they can't afford to miss out on this talent. And then on the flip side, if you're a job seeker, you know, a candidate looking for a job, there is a ton of remote opportunity in this new market that didn't exist before because companies were really focused on, you know, an on-site culture, and we see all of that changing now. So there's a chance for companies to really take the time to be mindful and strategic here, almost like reinvent their interview process. What needs to be top of mind here is how candidates are experiencing the interview process. And at the same time, job seekers can really take this moment to kind of pause and think about what's truly important to them and what kind of company culture they want to be part of. And a tip to job seekers, you know, a company's interview process can be a really great litmus test of the type of company culture that you would potentially be joining. Finally, if you have a healthy and organized remote process and you've implemented it, you've kind of worked out the kinks, you can potentially see an increase in speed and efficiency of actually getting candidates to offer and finding that right mutual fit. If you have the advantage of a remote interviewer pool, we highly recommend that you take advantage of that because the more interviewers you have, the faster you can conduct interviewers. If you have all of those people up to speed, you're not necessarily having to wait until all of the right people are in the office on the right day to then do an on-site interview. So there really is this opportunity to move candidates through the interview process more quickly than before, which is just a benefit to both the candidate and the company. So we're going to have another poll question here. And the question is, what is your company's level of experience conducting remote interviews? We'll give you a few seconds to answer this one. You're either new to the process, you've done a few interviews here and there, or you're veterans to the remote process. Give you a few more seconds here. So it looks like 47% of you have done a few remote interviews, here and there, with 29% of you being veterans and 24% of you being brand new to the process. So we hope there's something in this webinar for all of those groups.
Great. And so, yeah, it sounds like based on what we've gotten from the polls so far, a lot of you are going to potentially be the ones who are going to be helping either candidates navigate a remote process or helping build out a remote process. And it may be a situation where your company has not done this, maybe significantly or very often, or for all roles, like we're sort of forced into now. So, it's good to sort of think about how you want that to look as you build out a process. So, before you start actual interviews, it's really important that you take the time to define the role and what the process is going to look like. So make sure that you're anchoring your interview process to assess for both, the technical skills and the soft skills, and then you're thinking about how you're going to do that with a remote interview process. And then set expectations around what success looks like. So you want to create the process where you can come to a decision at the end of the process, even if you've never met the candidate in person. And it's really important that you train your interview team on sort of these remote hiring best practices. So don't assume that everyone on your team, is comfortable with remote interviewing, and so it's important to make sure that you're over communicating, that you're syncing with your hiring team virtually before the interview, and that each interviewer clearly knows what they're assessing for and how they're going to assess for that. And then I think one of the most important pieces here is creating a positive candidate experience. So I think a lot of times we think about candidate experience in terms of how it feels when the candidate comes to the office and feel welcomed and get a sense for the culture and the team and all of those things. And so how do we sort of ensure that there's a positive candidate experience even when the candidate's only interacting with the team remotely? So part of that is going to be, communicating with the candidate what they can expect from the interview process. So what each step is going to look like, how they can prepare. As a recruiter, you may want to look at different ways to build rapport with a candidate. So, potentially think about doing your recruiter screens as a video call instead of a phone call. Or building in additional touch points with the candidate, throughout the interview process so that they're feeling highly engaged with you and with the team. And then you want to brand your interview process. So, because the candidate's not going to get the opportunity necessarily to come into the office, you may want to have some branded interview prep material that includes not only sort of how they can prepare for the interview itself, but blog posts, videos, pictures that represent your company culture and your team's culture. You want to make sure you test your technology beforehand. So especially if you're new to using any of the video conferencing or maybe shared coding tools, make sure you test that out before the interview. And then take the time to familiarize yourself with the questions and your focus areas if you're an interviewer ahead of time, so that you feel comfortable sort of having authentic interactions and not sounding like you're reading off of a script in the interviews.
And then as an interviewer, during the interview, there's a couple of things that you want to keep really top of mind. So the first one is it's okay to call out or acknowledge your surroundings. It's okay to let the person that you're speaking to know that there might be like background noise or kids or pets or roommates or partners or, all of these distractions or disruptions. And it's also okay to call out and acknowledge that, the situation is potentially a little bit strange. Kind of ask them how they're experiencing their own situation. It's just a good way to kind of set the stage, break the ice, and, get rid of some of that awkwardness that can happen when you have your very first video call with someone who's looking for a job. The next is to be authentic. And so if you can, it's a really good idea to internalize interview questions and define what you're looking for kind of prior to getting on that call so that you can use the call as a time to really engage and interact more with the candidate. You can think through things like how you're going to be taking notes. Are you going to be taking notes, on your computer where potentially the other person can hear you kind of typing away? Or are you going to potentially use a pen and paper and write them down? So thinking about what works for you, but what also might be the least disruptive for the person you're interviewing. Don't be afraid to dig deeper than you normally might if you're interviewing somebody in person. As humans, we are kind of subconsciously recognizing all of these nonverbal cues and all of these other signals that come across in person, but you may not have that if you're, interviewing somebody virtually. So don't be afraid to ask, follow-up questions or get more information, because you definitely don't want to leave the call feeling like you don't have the information that you need to make an informed decision. And finally, be empathetic. Not everybody communicates in the same way, especially over video chat, right? I mean, I don't know how many times I've been on a call where, like, I think the person's looking over here, but they're actually think that they're looking at the camera. So like all of these things are like really, really challenging over a video call. And so just because somebody isn't making eye contact or, smiling, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not interested or engaged or listening to you. So I think it's important as an interviewer to really look for other cues that candidates are engaged. For example, maybe asking you to repeat something or asking a follow-up question. So there are all things to keep top of mind during the interview.
All right. And so after the interview, more importantly than ever, it's really valuable for you to submit your feedback in the same day that you have the interview. So that will allow for hiring managers and recruiters to have visibility into decisions, and then it should also help to drive more effective debriefs and faster decision making, and also better communication with the candidates. And then we want to make sure that there are debriefs that are happening after every on-site, especially in the remote world. So this is going to be really helpful in just understanding, being able to come together as a team and talk about the candidate as well as how the process is working if you're trying out an interview process remotely for the first time. And I recommend as a recruiter that you potentially set an agenda for those debriefs. So which order are people going to share feedback in, and then play moderator. So help to make sure that everybody's voice is being heard, because sometimes a group discussion dynamic can feel a little different over Zoom. And then you want to, before, as you're establishing the process, you want to establish your decision-making timeline. So who are the decision makers and what's sort of the timeline at the end of the process in terms of making a decision. And then knowing that, those timelines may change, with the climate we're in right now, things are different every day. So being really transparent with candidates about what's going on, and sort of like relaying to them where the company may be at in terms of being able to approve offers and things like that is just going to be really valuable for that candidate. And then you want to ensure that the candidates have all the information that they need to make this decision. So keep in mind that a lot of candidates, they may be, this may be their first time doing a completely remote interview process, and they're making a decision on coming to a company where they may be in the long term working out of the office and working with the team in person. And so remembering and empathizing with the fact that that's a really big decision to make without them having met anybody in person. And so finding ways to maybe synthesize some of those more casual get to know you closing meetings that happen with hiring managers, with the team. We've done things like dinners and happy hours and coffees and things like that. So how do you create that environment over Zoom or over video? So virtual coffees or maybe virtual meetings with the team. And maybe, as a recruiter, you might facilitate some of those a little bit, or give them some prompts to talk about, or maybe, even like play an online game together or something that sort of like allows, for the candidate to interact with your team, as well as sort of like negates for some of the awkwardness that might exist in a online meeting. And then lastly, you want to ensure that your company has a remote onboarding process in place, and understand what that's going to look like and how is that going to be different. What do you need in order to make sure the candidate, or now employee, gets their equipment and gets that set up? And, is that going to be something that, delays their start date, or you need specific information by a certain date from them. So making sure that you have all that information ahead of time is going to really help to make that process smooth in getting that person started at the company. All right, and then we're going to jump into the job seeker lens. We're going to start with a poll question. So what is your level of experience in participating in remote interviews? So in terms of actually being a job seeker and being interviewed. So we'll give a few seconds here. All right, so it looks like the majority of people have done a few remote interviews, so 54%, and then the other half are sort of split between either being new or being veterans. So sounds like there's not a lot of people who are veterans to remote interviewing, which is great context.
So these are just a couple of recommendations that those, whether you're, a veteran to the process of remote interviewing or brand new, these are a couple of things that you could potentially do as a job seeker before you actually get on your first interview. So a really good first step, especially in the climate that we're in right now, would be to identify the companies that are currently hiring. Some of the companies in the current environment are actually doing really, really well, and they're hiring quite a few new people. Some industries that come to mind are on-demand delivery tech, streaming media, fintech, maybe health tech right now. So kind of identifying the companies that are hiring first is a really good place to start. Second of all, utilize your network. Your network is so valuable. Set up virtual coffee chats or virtual catch-ups with people. Don't necessarily go into these conversations assuming that you're going to leave with like a job opportunity in hand, or somebody says, oh yeah, I'm hiring, let's get you set up with an interview. that could happen. You know, it never like hurts to talk to those people, but imagine that you're going to do more information sharing in these conversations. Talk about what you're seeing on the job market. Really use it as a catch up and to gain more intel rather than like, oh, I'm going to talk to this person and they're going to, you know, route me to a job. The third thing to do is look at job boards that are focused specifically on remote hiring. There are a ton of great resources out there. And we actually have a slide at the end of our presentation here that has a list of job boards that are posting remote specific roles. And then finally, think about what companies may be looking for in a remote employee. They are likely looking for candidates that are self-motivated and self-directed, so can be really autonomous, are super detail-oriented and organized, have strong communication skills, whether that's like written communication, you know, responding to emails or calls really quickly, or really strong verbal communication, and candidates that are credible and trustworthy. So, you know, as you're kind of thinking through your previous experience, even if it's maybe not remote specific experience, it would be a good idea to kind of highlight each one of these qualities, and then be prepared to tell stories during the interview that really speak to you having those qualities.
All right, and then during the interview, so similarly to if you were the interviewer or if you were the interviewee, you want to be aware of your background, your physical background, and what may be distracting behind you, as well as background noise. So you might use headphones versus, you know, normally I just play sound out of my computer. You know, you want to sort of optimize for those things, but also it's totally fine to be authentic about what you may have going on around you, because we're all right there with you. You want to test out your microphone and the video ahead of time. You know, ideally, you've used the video conferencing system before, but if you haven't, definitely make sure that you are comfortable with that. Make sure that you are staying authentic. I think especially over video chat. So doing things like preparing an about me and questions ahead of time that are going to reflect your values and career goals are super important. And also just you may be a little bit more animated, you know, over video than you would be in person. Because they can only see sort of the top part of your body. So that ability to read body language can be a little bit more difficult for the interviewer. So the more that you can portray, you know, your authentic self, the easier they'll be able to pick up on that. And then, you know, have notes prepared where you can easily access them. And so that's sort of like almost easier on a remote interview because you can have that side by side with your video. And be proactive about getting information that's necessary to make a decision. So know what you need to get out of these interviews in order to feel confident in making a decision, and ask for that. If you don't know what the next steps are, you can always ask. And so really important to just sort of, this is that moment where you as a job seeker can empathize with companies who may be just building out their remote process. And so there might be a little bit of uncertainty around what that's going to look like. And so, you know, sometimes just asking the question, they may be able to give you more information. And then you want to dig into the company's capability to accommodate remote work. So a lot of companies are kind of developing this on the fly, but it's good to get a sense for you know, what that actually looks like in a day-to-day, and what your interaction is going to feel like with the team working remotely for, you know, an extended period of time potentially. And so that's good to sort of ask about that and get a sense for what that dynamic has felt like for the team so far.
All right, and then after the interview, so, you know, you've had all the rounds of the remote interview, or you think you've had all of them. What should you do? you feel like, okay, well, I made it through the interview process. Follow up. Following up is so important. It may be even more important in this scenario when, you know, remote interviewers, you can do a lot more as a remote interviewer. You don't know how many interviews that person may have conducted that day or that week. And so following up, sending a quick email, thanking the interviewer for their time, it's probably not going to make or break whether you end up getting an offer from that company, but it certainly doesn't hurt. And it's a really good way to, you know, stand out and make the interviewer feel appreciated. Second of all, you might have to be a little bit more proactive about pursuing those follow-up conversations or virtual chats to answer any of those remaining questions. So you want to make sure that you as the interviewer, like I said, are in a really good, or interviewee, sorry, are in a really good position to make a decision quickly. So don't be afraid to reach out and say, hey, you know, I just have these other questions. Could I talk to this person? Or do you mind if I have coffee with, you know, my potential manager over Zoom one more time? I just have a few more questions to ask them. So don't be shy about asking for those, because both you and the company want to know if there's a fit there kind of as soon as possible. And then finally, figure out what's truly important for you in a new role outside of kind of what the office looks like or what it feels to visit, right? Chances are that in the past, well, if you're me, the way that the office environment looks and feels has probably influenced your career decision a little bit, either consciously or subconsciously. I've definitely found myself thinking, wow, the team is great. My impact is going to be huge. But that other company has kombucha on tap, so I don't know. So in this case, none of that is going to be a factor, right? You're going to have to base your decision on things outside of the office environment. So kind of identify, you know, what's the most important to you. Is the impact going to be really important to you? Do you feel like you're super connected to the company's mission? Do you think you'd love working with that team? If you're feeling overwhelmed, you know, and you're like, oh gosh, I don't know what's the most important to me, it can be really helpful to stack rank your priorities. So then when the time comes, you can quickly and confidently make a decision, even if you haven't seen the office or met the team in person.
And then these are the additional resources that we were talking about. So remote job boards, and then Binc has a resource page here, which is basically a ongoing list of companies that are hiring during COVID-19. There are many, many lists of these floating around out here as well. So pretty easy to dig up some lists that are continuously being updated around what companies are still hiring. And so you can really get a sense for where you should target your efforts as a job seeker. And we'll send out these resources to you after the webinar.
So I think we're going to jump into some Q&A. And Boris, are you going to lead this section?
No, actually, I am.
Oh, Tawny. Sorry.
Hi, thank you, Leah and Liz, for sharing all that great information with us. We've had quite a few questions come in through the chat and the Q&A. If you have more, just keep adding them to the Q&A box. So there were actually quite a few that came in regarding using remote interviews or video interviews. So can you discuss how a video interview is different from the phone interviews that have been typical for a while, at least for the first round screening interviews?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. I think that the reason why we would encourage video interviews earlier on in the process is more because we are anticipating that the later components of the process that would normally be in person and potentially meeting the teams and those types of things are all going to be remote. And so getting ahead and sort of starting to build that face-to-face rapport with candidates earlier on in the process, I think is going to be really valuable in sort of creating that connection with the candidates to the recruiters and to the hiring managers early on in the process, which will then carry through to the remote on-site and decision making. So that's why we would recommend that. I don't think that there's a major difference in a general sense, but when you're doing a completely remote process, I think it can be super valuable at the beginning of the process to use video.
Yeah, and we're kind of, as recruiters, giving out a few kind of trade secrets here of like, it's to our advantage to build a relationship with job seekers early on, because, you want to have that personal relationship. So then when you get to things like talking about compensation, or, helping a candidate make a decision, you're in kind of that like mutual environment of trust, to then be able to really openly talk about those things with candidates. So I think as a job seeker, it's probably not that much different, except for you maybe need to like get dressed, get out of pajamas, but only, of course, from like your chest up, because that's really all we can see.
Thank you. So as we start using Zoom and WebEx, et cetera, do you recommend that the interview be recorded? It would make note-taking less burdensome.
I can jump in there. I would not recommend that. I don't know the legality around that, but I think it actually, without kind of getting consent from everybody involved, I think it actually might be illegal. So, while that may be easier for the recruiter, I would actually advise against that unless you specifically have permission and like the candidate knows ahead of time that you're going to be recording it. Can totally understand how it would be easier for the recruiter, but also remember that, your notes are probably going to be what the rest of the hiring team is going to look at. And so you want to make sure that those notes are super thorough. So yeah, I don't know, Liz, if you have another opinion on that, but I think it's kind of the moral gray area there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I am also not sure of the legality component of it, but I do think, thinking about it from the candidate perspective, it might make them feel a little bit more nervous. I know I feel more nervous presenting when I know it's recorded. So I think it's probably a similar feeling. I like the thought behind it, which is to make the interview more sort of in the moment and be able to focus on the candidate and not have them be distracted. But I think in terms of the distraction of just knowing that the interaction is recorded, it probably wouldn't be the best experience for candidates.
Thank you. And then there's another one around using Zoom. So for companies and candidates doing remotes, you say be authentic about your background, et cetera. What's your sense of the best practices regarding Zoom's capability to use the virtual background? Should people be using a favorite outdoor shot or just stick with the Zoom defaults?
So I think in the tech world, a lot of people have been having fun with Zoom. And so I actually really like the idea of authentically representing yourself. And I think, I've been on some Zooms lately where people have actually had the background of, of their office where they would be working. So it feels like, you're still at the office. And so you're still sort of having that experience. So I think that those can be really great if they're not distracting. So I wouldn't put up something that's really flashy, but definitely I also think from the perspective of an interviewer, that can maybe create sort of like a fun way for the candidate to get a sense for you and your company culture and your team culture. So I think those can be beneficial. The other benefit to those virtual backgrounds is that they do cancel out what's behind you. So if somebody is walking behind you, if kids are running around, it's going to focus in on you versus, sort of seeing what's happening in the background. So that can also be another benefit of leveraging those.
As
Thank
long
you.
as you don't like turn yourself into a potato and then you can't turn yourself back into a human, because I've definitely read of that happening. So just make sure you know how to use it if you're going to use it.
I'll add a note to that. It's common in just standard interview practices, or it's perfectly reasonable for a candidate to ask the recruiter before they go on site for any, like, what the culture is like, any dress standards, so that they could, appropriately kind of represent themselves or best set themselves up for success. And it's equally, common for a recruiter to prepare their candidate with those sorts of tips. I think, given this new remote environment, perfectly reasonable for a job seeker to ask their recruiter for any kind of norms or standards related to, remote, the remote experience. And equally, if you're a recruiter representing, good tip to, add a set of best practices, and that may include background, dress, or the lack of standard altogether, which is totally, fine and appropriate right now as well.
Thank you for jumping in, Boris. Another question that came through was, how should one assess dress code for a video interviewer? Or how can you figure out in advance what the interviewer expects a candidate to wear?
So kind of jumping off what Boris said, we definitely encourage you to maybe reach out to the person beforehand and just say, what's the dress code? But if it's a first round interview, maybe you don't have that information. You probably for tech, I think a good rule of thumb. So at Binc, we always strive to kind of be one level up in formality of whatever we think the environment is that we're gonna be in. So I think you'll find a lot of tech companies are like jeans and t-shirts kind of places. It's better to be overdressed than underdressed, right? So I think we would likely recommend maybe like a button-down shirt or like a blouse. So like maybe business casual. If you're more dressed up than the interviewer, it's not going to be, a huge deal, but it might be a little embarrassing if you're less dressed up than the interviewer. So I think a button-down is a good rule of thumb. But I think there are a lot of, kind of competing perspectives about this. So really, like, as the job seeker, you want to be, kind of authentic to yourself, and you want to be comfortable. So I think it's really up to your best judgment, but I always go with the button down.
Thank you. Another question is, are there any topics that from an HR law perspective are now okay to talk about during an interview, like kids, family, living environment, etc., now that everything's moved to remote?
It's a good question. And I think we have sort of like referenced a lot about, empathizing and maybe talking about what's going on in the background, or, checking with the other person and seeing how they've been doing through this whole, sort of COVID-19 situation. But, the biggest thing that I think I would say is that, I'm not a legal person, but interviews, the same standards are going to apply. So you absolutely cannot ask about, do they have kids? Anything that would basically, fall under sort of those protected classes. Absolutely don't initiate a conversation about. So it's totally fine to sort of share, as an interviewer, what your experience has been, what your home life is like, and, ask more generic questions to the candidate. And as a job seeker, it's okay to share what you choose to share. But just know that legally, those questions can't be asked because we can't use those in making hiring decisions.
Thank you. Another question, how does interviewing change if you're interviewing a C-suite candidate remotely?
Yeah, this is a good question. and this was one that we received ahead of time. We were sort of thinking about it. I think that, generally when you're doing the executive interviewing or hiring, there tend to be a lot of touch points and a lot of sort of in-person and, maybe over the phone touch points. And so the thought is that the change would really be focusing on creating those touch points via video and phone as much as possible. The other thing that might be possible or easier is that, generally when you're interviewing someone for a C-suite role, they need to interview with a ton of really high-level folks. And so being able to actually have the flexibility to schedule those during different times might speed up the interview process a bit. And so I think that provides a little bit more flexibility in terms of scheduling. But just being cognizant of creating as many touch points as you need to for the interview team to get what they need and for this person to make a decision, and being super clear with whoever the hiring manager is on what it is that they need to make this decision, and sort of making sure that they're invested in hiring someone even if they haven't met them in person. So I think you really need that buy-in ahead of time for all the roles, but it's going to be especially important for these executive level roles.
Thank you.
I'll add to that.
All right, go ahead, Boris.
Liz and Tawny. On the note of C-suite, and I think this could extend out to any type of role, companies are certainly being incredibly creative, and equally candidates are being incredibly creative in their ability to evaluate and assess via a remote capacity. Some, though, that have an in-person component to their evaluation and are not able to creatively adapt, are choosing to put their processes or interests on pause. And so in a C-suite capacity or in other capacities, if a company or a job seeker is not able to shift their assessment abilities from in-person to remote, they're simply putting their either job search or hiring needs on pause until they feel they could get clearer line of sight to more confident, inspiring assessment abilities. And that's common, surely, in C-suite where in person and is a better part of the process, and equally in others as well.
Thank you, Boris. This next question was sent in before the webinar with when they registered. It's from a job seeker. It says, I'm a marketing and outreach professional with 4 years of experience in the education and travel field. My field is currently not hiring due to COVID-19 and economic impacts. I really need help identifying which industries are still hiring that might be relevant to me and my skill set. Can you provide some insight on where I can look?
Yeah, so we actually have a webpage, which is listed on the resource slide, which will be sent out after we wrap up this webinar, with a list of companies and industries that are currently hiring. But a few that are kind of top of mind are kind of online payment processing and fintech, anything in like the health manufacturing, health tech space, maybe streaming media. So think like Netflix, Spotify, Hulu, those streaming services that are seeing an increase in traffic right now. And then, I don't know, Liz, can you think of it? Any others kind of pop to you?
I think you covered a lot of them. The only other one that I can think of is video conferencing, obviously. So, Zoom, although they're having their privacy issues right now, it sounds like they have their entire team paused on developing new features just to focus on the privacy issues. So they're working really hard to fix those things. But companies who are doing that type of conferencing, Slack, who's doing, communications, all those types of companies are really thriving right now because they're being essentially overutilized in a way that they haven't been before. And so they're overloaded. And there's almost there's the struggle of bandwidth when it comes to interviewers, because the engineering teams are working extremely hard on keeping up with the influx of traffic, and so that's something to keep in mind as an interviewer, and also maybe as a recruiter, is that you're going to have to sort of get creative around increasing bandwidth, and as a interviewer or as a job seeker, you may need to be a little bit more patient with some of those companies because they have quite a lot going on behind the scenes, and so that's something to sort of keep top of mind as well.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions. This one came in through chat. As an interviewee, what are the best ways to posture, present yourself, as well as create a peaceful and welcoming background environment if given the opportunity to?
The best way to present yourself. I think just be authentic, be true to yourself. We talked about the use of those potential virtual backgrounds, but I think in going back to that kind of theme of empathy, do the best that you can with the situation that you're in, with what you have. And if there are disruptions or things go wrong, or maybe you have some interruptions, I think that the interviewer in this case is going to understand. But that's why it could be important to call those things out ahead of time, so that if they do happen, it's not like, oh my gosh, this happened and now I'm super embarrassed and I can't recover. It's like, yeah, if I said that maybe, my toddler was going to come in and wave to the camera, and that happened, and now we can move on. So I think just being really authentic, and knowing that everybody is approaching this situation with a lot of empathy on both sides.
Thank you. The next question is, due to the pandemic we're in, do you believe it's fair for companies to expect the same time commitments from their employees who are at home with kids from 8 to 5 p.m.? Or is it fair to even expect the same level of performance?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I think that the way companies are reacting to this COVID-19 situation, as a job seeker, to me, to understand, what different companies are doing, I think would be a really great sort of peek into, how they're valuing their employees in terms of their wellness, their work-life balance, and being understanding of everybody having differing situations. So I think that would actually be something that as a job seeker, I would want to ask about and understand how, what do the expectations look like? As someone at a company, I think that, there absolutely needs to be understanding that, folks are going to have, if they have kids at home, they're going to need to maybe work different hours or be accommodating of that. And, I think that the most important piece is, to communicate what you need, and to ask for the accommodations that you need to make it work. Every day I think is a new challenge in terms of the types of things that we need to deal with. So I think that, this is sort of there's no cut and dry answer. But absolutely it would be something that I would be wanting to, sort of understand, as a job seeker.
Thank you. And then I think the final question is, do you have any guidance around holding super days over video and reading body language?
So I think super day in this case means a batch interview. So having kind of a lot of short interviews back to back with an interviewer. I think it's something that kind of big consulting firms or finance firms will often do. Especially if they're talking about, hiring a bunch of people for the summer or hiring a bunch of new grads. If you're going to do this over video, and it's totally doable, right? I almost think that it might be easier to do this virtually than doing it on site, as you know, you're not having to fly in or bring on site like this huge group of people. But in terms of guidance, organization is going to be key, right? I mean, you want to make sure that you are adhering to the blocks of interviews that you have, making sure that you're scheduling in breaks between those interviews, because I'm sure, as some of the interviewers on here know, back-to-back interviews in quick succession like that can be really, really draining for both the interviewer and the job seeker. And so definitely scheduling in, you know, short breaks in between batches of interviews. In terms of reading body language, I mean, I think that as an interviewer and a job seeker, you know, we're doing our best, right? I'm potentially even more animated over Zoom than I am in real life. I do a lot of like crazy hand waving, but it's really because like I'm almost trying harder to get my point across, since I know that, you know, interviewers or people interacting with me, interviewees, are not going to pick up on all of those kind of small nonverbal cues that they would if I was interviewing in person. So yeah, I think, you know, as somebody who is interviewing or an interviewee or an interviewer, definitely, you know, doing your best to like make eye contact, be expressive, have a level of enthusiasm, if that's authentically how you're feeling, of course. And still trying to like have those visual cues come across. And then when should you use video versus a phone call? I mean, that's really a preference. It's up to you. But it is, I think, easier to have a connection and build that rapport if you can actually see the other person's face. So when I'm kind of looking for a more personal connection, that's when I would utilize the video versus just calling someone on the phone.
All right, thank you for answering the questions, and thank you to everyone who submitted questions. Before I turn it over to Boris for a quick wrap up, we'd love to get your feedback on this webinar. So I'm going to launch a quick poll. Feel free to answer it. And thank you again.
Thank you all again for taking time out of your day to join us, certainly in these unprecedented times with 10 million people recently filing for unemployment in the world, seemingly shifting to a remote culture. This is, you know, very much on a massive amount of our, you know, community and country's minds. So hopefully this was able to add, you know, some little bit of value to one of you or someone in your respective worlds as it relates to topic of how to get hired or how to hire remotely. And with that, just look for more webinars from us shortly. We have some ideas for more in the coming week ahead. So thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.